Welcome to Transition Planning for Students on the Autism Spectrum. You'll be presented with practical ideas, and this section is for students who are starting their middle school experience. Transition is a natural part of all educational programs. On your page is a quote from Kathy Pratt, PhD at the Indiana Resource Center for Autism, and she states, "Students with and without disabilities must adjust to changes in teachers, classmates, schedules, buildings, and routines. The transition from one grade to the next can be especially challenging for a student on the autism spectrum. However, these students can make this shift more easily with careful planning and preparation." So this webinar is designed to give teachers and parents some just tips and some resources for making that transition easier for your students. Transitions and change are often difficult with or without a disability. Please look at the list of things that transitions can produce or cause within a student. Anxiety, fear, withdrawal, that apathetic, I can't do this, obsessive compulsive behaviors. If you plan properly for transition, you will reduce a lot of these feelings, and therefore you won't see some of the behaviors that I just spoke about. Remember that some of the behaviors you might see during transition are a byproduct of anxiety, and with some careful planning you can reduce anxiety and therefore behaviors. But you might expect some regression because this is an awfully big change for students on the spectrum. Middle school prepares a student for greater independence and individuality. It's the beginning and preparation for high school, and it's part of the journey and progress towards adulthood. Middle school is reported to be one of the toughest times for kids with an ASD because it becomes more socially demanding. The greater independence means that kids aren't guided through their social community daily or in the same manner that we do that at the elementary school level. Kids aren't paired with one another like they are at the elementary school level, and just those social demands, starting to have boyfriends and girlfriends, starts to really become a problem for kids, some kids on the ASD. Staff at the middle school generally expect more maturity, and there's a huge leap, one that I think we don't understand until kids are presented with that change, but it is a big leap for our kids. Remember, middle school is a time to explore academics, explore through electives. Social relatedness is an exploration time, but again, as I just said, we need to guide our kids and still give them adult supports. Middle school expectations. Kids are expected to move between classes, to follow a bell schedule, which is brand new, to be more organized, develop and use study skills, and that grades become more important. Money and time management becomes part of the school environment, and we no longer have recesses with a lot of equipment, but there are common hangout areas. Things to consider in the middle school grades. Accessing a new building. So most kids have never been in a building that large, and accessing that building and knowing about that building becomes an issue. Kids have multiple teachers. There are new rules, schedules, and routines. There are many more new social rules, many of which are part of a hidden curriculum, and I would refer people to that book called The Hidden Curriculum for some explanations about that. And we give kids in the middle school a lot of extracurricular experiences because, as I previously said, this is a time to explore academically and socially, and we give kids those opportunities at middle school to have some exploration and develop interests, but it can really be an uncomfortable time for many kids, and certainly for kids with an ASD. Accessing a new building. Most middle schools are a lot larger, and there are multiple entrances and exits. I know in my experience for kids who've had trouble with that, it's been important to set up with their parents or with them or both that they use one entrance and one exit. For kids who are riding a bus, that needs to be clearly defined. So thinking about that ahead of time and having kids walk that schedule or walk to that place and have arrival and departure routines established can be really helpful. Kids need to know the rules for entering and exiting. Because of some of the things that have happened nationally, doors that might be open at the beginning of the school and the end of school become locked, and students need to be aware of that. As I mentioned, we need to know where the bus is going to drop off kids and pick them up. It's really helpful to obtain a map of the school. And what I like to do is color code that and show kids where their homeroom is. Generally, 6th graders have a homeroom where they spend 2 or 3 classes before they start to fan out. If your student with an ASD is accessing the resource room or goes and sees the speech pathologist, having a map and color coding where those different areas in the building are can be very helpful. And also be sure to locate the student's locker on a map so that they are very aware of where their locker is located. Multiple teachers. Most students will have multiple teachers, and this may be new, though oftentimes at the later grades in elementary school there are some different changes. Somebody might be teaching math while another person teaches science. There might be some of those changes, and they do have some electives, but there are many more teachers in the middle school, and there's just much more staff. So this is a big change for our kids. Our kids on the ASD need to know each staff person and their role and responsibility for them. So it's very nice before school starts if parents can bring kids to the school and just go around and introduce them. A little tip that I used with kids who are making a transition into middle school is at the 5th grade level, and it was often with a speech pathologist. We videotaped each student. We worked that out ahead of time. We had them list their strengths and their weaknesses and basically do a video for their new homeroom teacher about themselves. So then when the kids came to school before it actually started and were walking around and meeting teachers, they could give that DVD to their teacher who could watch it later, and it just gave some really good information about each student, and the kids loved doing that. Learn how to make an appointment with each staff person if needed. You might see a person at 9 o'clock in the morning and then never see them again for the rest of the day, but you have a question about an assignment or a grade, or you need to have extended time. So how do you make an appointment with that staff member? How do you find out when their free period is? And making sure that students understand that and practice that is really important. And then it's really important for parents to learn how they can best meet with each staff person. That whole thing changes a lot between elementary school, where you've got a lot of contact with one teacher, to middle school, where it just isn't the same. So understanding that and setting up opportunities for that and a routine for that is really important. New rules, schedules, and routines. 2 really important pieces of information that students going into middle school really need to understand and have a copy of. There's almost always, I don't want to completely say always, that there is almost always a student handbook and a student planner, and they could be combined. But in the student handbook, there's a lot of useful information about just some of the comings and goings for middle school and some of the rules and some of the routines. Explains just a lot of policy and dress code. So I really advise kids to look for that and maybe get a copy of that in the spring if it's not going to change over the summertime. And that would be a great thing for kids to review over the summer with their family, so that they're very familiar with the many, many things that are written in the student handbook. Most middle schools have this planner, and it's very important to look and see how it's the same or different from a planner that might have been used in elementary school. Many teachers require the use of a planner, and I just think it's good practice for kids to keep track of their assignments and due dates, because there are many changes and lots of assignments with grades becoming more meaningful. In the student handbook, you would be made aware of A or B schedule and what that is like, how is it posted, and when does it occur, and are there any other alternative schedules to the regular schedule, and how are they posted. Sometimes there's an assembly schedule, for instance. Sometimes there's a late start schedule, and so those are generally listed in the student handbook and discussed. New rules, schedules, and routines continued. What are some of the unwritten rules? Some of the unwritten rules have to do with using the stairs, entering and exiting classrooms. Different teachers have different routines. So understanding that and exploring that and discussing that with the individual staff members is really important. I'll give you an example of a kid that just didn't realize that when the teacher's door was closed, that you were not supposed to go into the classroom, that teacher would come to the door and open it, and then it was time to enter. There's a lot of kids that hang out in halls before school starts. They arrive early, and sometimes there's a common place where everyone meets. That could be in the gym or the cafeteria. Sometimes it's just in the hall. So just some of those unwritten rules about those kinds of procedures and routines need to be watched for and talked about. And then I think it's important to think about roughhouse and play versus bullying. Kids at the middle school are just become more physical and goof around in a physical way, but there is a fine line between what is roughhousing and play and what is bullying, and giving students a clear understanding of that difference and what to do if they are bullied and if things become inappropriate is a real important discussion to have. Restrooms. So this might be the first time that your student has been in a building where there's a urinal, if it's a boy or a young man. So what are the kind of rules and routines for that? I think there's generally an expectation that you use the restroom during your passing periods between classes, or during your lunch hour, or when you go to PE. But there would be routines for exiting a classroom. Generally a pass is required. There are just a lot of differences and a lot of different rules and routines when it comes to accessing the restrooms in middle schools. Academics. There's homework and grades, organization, science labs, art, and computer labs, and all those take on just different significance going into middle school. There's a greater emphasis on attendance and participation, and we begin to really start to separate social promotion and the grades you get. You can fail a class. Now in middle school you still don't have to take that class again, but social promotion has really been part of the elementary school years, and it starts to tighten down in middle school. Homework can greatly affect a grade, and it might greatly affect teamwork when you're working in cooperative learning groups in your, say, science class or social studies class. If different roles and responsibilities are assigned for a particular assignment, and everyone's supposed to come back and come together and have that material in order to proceed the next day, if a student comes back and doesn't have that work done, that can affect not only the academic part of the task, but it really starts to affect kids socially. And middle school kids can be very brisk in the way that they talk to one another when something like that isn't accomplished. In science labs, generally there's partner teaming. There are different rules. There's setup and cleanup, and all those things I think a lot of teachers explain at the beginning of the year, and then there's a lot of expectation that they'll just intuit and look around and know what to do, and that's not often the case with a student who's on the autism spectrum. So giving more opportunities to explore that room, again, that would be a critical room to visit before school starts. It's just it's a great thing to do so that the kids can become very familiar with what are some of the lab expectations. The same in art. Art classes at the middle school level are really designed to be exploratory. They're exposed to all sorts of different medium. There might be a unit on clay, there might be a unit on color mixing, there might be a unit on acrylics. There are just all different kinds of units that are presented, and not only do we need to consider the sensory piece of art and probably in science, but I think that, again, the exploratory part of middle school can stretch some kids. It's intended to stretch kids, but that can be a difficult time for kids on the autism spectrum because they are less flexible than their peer group. Getting them to having them become involved in something that's not their first choice can be kind of challenging. Computer labs, they're generally designed to be skill-based. It's not that you get to go and play computer games. That's really not part of the mission. The kids will be designing maybe their own web page. They might be exploring different websites, but there are lots of rules and regulations and routines that are in the computer lab, and those need to be clearly discussed with students on the spectrum, because you can lose that privilege and that can be disastrous. PE. Okay, this is a big change as well. In elementary school, you change your shoes. In middle school, you start to dress down. And so that's maybe a vocabulary term that our student with an ASD doesn't understand. What does dress down mean? Well, it means that you're going to go change your clothes. And you're going to change your clothes in a pretty open, less private arena, and there are lots of social rules around that. That really needs to be discussed with kids. They need to go down into the locker area and look at that. Are things locked? Do they use a padlock? I think there needs to be, with the PE teacher, just a lot of agreements and understanding about what happens when you go down into the locker room. Showering is generally an option, but it's optional, and so I think some kids see those showers or see an area, then they can become very, very nervous. So discussing that is really important. Most PE locker rooms have a locker. Some are locked, some are not. So again, that needs to be discussed, because nothing of value, if you're not going to lock your locker down there, nothing of value should be taken down there. And that really needs to be discussed with our students, probably more than once. In PE, it's more team-oriented. They do work on skills, but there's a lot of team play. And sportsmanship is really a part of that whole process, and it's part of your grades. So explaining what is sportsmanship. It's not just winning and losing. If it's a basketball unit, it's that you're passing the ball to a peer. There's just a lot of information about that the PE teacher can give to kids before class starts that might reduce a lot of anxiety. And then there's usually some sort of routine. Oftentimes, kids are supposed to come in, dress down, come upstairs, and start warm-ups. Well, what are the warm-ups? Does your student need a visual or some sort of checklist so that they know those routines, because there are many? The library. Students often can use a library on their own. Some middle schools are set up with study halls, and students can receive passes to go to the library. Sometimes libraries are open at lunchtime, and you can receive a pass to go after you eat. But passes are generally limited in number, and you might not be able to assume that you can have a pass every day. So that is definitely something to check out at the beginning of the year. I think it's important for students to receive some sort of brief tour of the library before school starts and understand some of those rules and routines. Libraries are used much more frequently for research, and sometimes if you're working on things in class, there might be a few passes that are distributed and you independently go down to the library to do research. So check out books or go and get something to take back to class so that you have that resource while kids are working together in a classroom setting. So understanding all that and how to access the library is very important. There are fees and fines, and knowing that that's not forgiven as it is in elementary school is something that's very important. Libraries also have open seating at middle school. So unlike elementary school where kids actually go in as a class and are told where to sit, it's much more open at middle school, and kids need to understand that and know the rules for that. In the student handbook, there probably is information about the library, and it would be really helpful to review that before starting school. The cafeteria. Again, this is really different from elementary school. In middle school, it's all open seating. So where we had pretty much assigned seating, is that it, like for a class at least, eats together. That's not the case in middle school, and it can be kind of a lonely time. So I really encourage kids to explore the cafeteria before it starts. Think about a friend that they might walk down to the cafeteria with, and think about where they might want to sit. Generally, there are many more food choices, and you can buy things. There's usually an a la carte kind of area daily where you can just buy French fries or something like that. And that's pretty different than from middle school. You can still bring your own cold lunch, but you can buy beverages and other things, and oftentimes there are vending machines. So that whole managing money and being somewhat private about your money and your wallet and how you show that around the school is pretty important. It's socially different in the cafeteria. It's not a recess any longer. Kids do have organized activities. In the spring and fall, there might be softball going on or shooting hoops and basket, but there's a lot of just walking and hanging out. And so that is very different. And our students can be pretty vulnerable at that time. So maybe providing some opportunity to look at who's out at recess or out at during free time that our kids can team up with is a nice opportunity. Electronics. Some schools allow the use of electronics during lunchtime. That is something that will be written in the student handbook, and some teachers will talk about it, but that really needs to be explored, and it needs to be understood by our students on the spectrum, as well as kids need to know that they need to guard their electronics. That is something that can get taken and stolen, and none of us want that to happen. Self-help and self-care. Middle school is a time when kids' bodies really start to change. They're starting to mature, using deodorant, just all those kinds of things are really, really starting to change. Body odor, hairstyles, cleanliness. There is a resource at the end of this webinar or associated with this webinar, and it's the Insider's Guide to Middle School, and it is filled with the information about taking care of your body and yourself as you become older and enter the middle school. So that is here for your use, and it was written by Debbie Green from the Columbia Regional Autism Program. There is probably a more strict dress code at middle school that is just pretty universally applied. I think in elementary school we might pull a kid aside and tell them that something is appropriate or inappropriate and talk to them, but that's not necessarily going to happen at middle school, but it is one of those things that can socially separate our kids from the general population. So just understanding the dress code, understanding appropriateness. wearing a SpongeBob t-shirt or a Powderpuff Girls t-shirt is probably not the best choice. Everybody just matures quite a bit in middle school, and a 6th grader is with a ninth grader in the same building generally. No, 6, 7, and 8. And there's a big difference between a 6th grader and an 8th grader. So just understanding dress code and first impressions is pretty important. And then again, the bathrooms, there are multiple bathrooms, they're not very private, and so does your student need some sort of accommodations, and what might that look like so that everyone's comfortable. And then I'm just going to give you this little tip. On YouTube, there is a YouTube video called Urinal Etiquette, and it is produced by, it looks like high school kids, but it's set to music, and it really gives the, for young boys, it really gives the urinal etiquette rules, and in a fun, kind of charming way. So I would refer anybody to that as another way to approach that topic. There are many new social rules. The language and vocabulary begin to change a lot. So depending on your student and their IEP, they may or may not be seeing a speech pathologist. If they are, this would be something for parents to talk about, look at the IEP, and make sure that just a lot of the vocabulary and just those unwritten social rules, so that they're addressed through the speech pathologist. Things like read your audience. What does that mean? Well, it means that you're going to look at what your peers are doing, you're going to look at what's going on in the hall, and you're going to make some quick social judgments about what you see and what you intuit, and that's not something that's real easy for our kids. Kids need to understand the difference between tattling and reporting. We don't tattle anymore. If you want to set yourself apart socially, go run to the teacher and tattle. But kids need to know that they aren't to be picked on, that if they see something, there's a zero tolerance policy. And what does that mean? If they see something that's dangerous or hear something that's dangerous, how do you privately go and report that to a staff member? There's a difference between teasing and bullying. Middle school kids are just notorious for teasing, and like I was talking about earlier with roughhousing. But our kids are sometimes pretty vulnerable, and so if a student is bullied, how do they privately go to a staff member and discuss that? And they might need some help. So who is their trusted adult that they can talk to first before they then go to administration? Students can receive a detention, and how, again, the student handbook clearly outlines that, but maybe that's something that needs to be very clearly understood, and maybe your student needs to go and talk to the person who's in charge of detention and see the room where detention occurs, or even see students after detention, see what that looks like, because you don't want any surprises with that. That can really cause a meltdown. There's a difference in social niceties, and I explained that with the language and vocabulary. Again, this is something that a speech pathologist can help your student with, but it's subtle, it changes. You might say hi to somebody in the hall. This is just an example. You might say hi to somebody in the hall during at the very beginning of passing, but if you see them later in the day, you just acknowledge them. It's what's called on the down low. It's very subtle. So having our kids understand some of that, so that they can extend themselves socially, is an important thing to do. And finally, or not finally, but gangs. This might be the first time that your student is presented with that. Gangs do start to form at the middle school age. There are illegal activities that occur in middle schools, and just having kids be aware of maybe what are some of the gang signs, dress, nonverbal kinds of things that happen, and how to conduct themselves and get themselves out of that is pretty important. And finally, they will see displays of affection at the middle school level, and so what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. Our kids are pretty vulnerable to modeling some socially inappropriate things as well as appropriate things, that I think discussing that is important. Extracurricular experiences are often a part of middle school. There can be service learning opportunities, and sometimes a class might approach that at one point in a term together. Those opportunities might be available after school. There are clubs, there's organized sports, and there are dances. So preparing our students for those opportunities and encouraging them, and it might be that an adult helps them really understand that and understand what they're getting involved with. It could be it's a wonderful opportunity for meeting and making social connection. But again, it might be breaking a routine, and so really having some guidance with that, and not assuming that a student with the ASD is going to understand what a club is for. Track is a great opportunity. Everybody can participate in track. It's a more individual sport, so that's a really nice thing for our kids to become involved in. And then exploring the whole idea of dances. Some of them occur during school hours, some of them are in the evening. So it's important that our kids understand those opportunities. Lockers. This might be the first time that your student has a locker, and so understanding hall lockers and what they're used for, and how to access them and when to access them is a really important thing to really carefully explore before school starts. Sometimes kids are asked to share a locker, and if that is a real issue, and it can be, I would speak to administration right away, perhaps through the case manager, because sometimes you can have a private locker, and that could just solve a multiple bunch of problems. Know your locker combination. There is a visual that's provided at the end of this webinar that can be used to show a kid their combination and have them practice it. But if you use that visual, and if a student has that visual, say, in their binder or in their notebook at the beginning of school until it's committed to memory, they have to know that that's really private. And never, never, never give your combination to anybody else. Kids have to learn and sometimes have it built right into their routine. When do they access their locker? There are too many kids that carry all their books in their backpack because they don't understand when they're supposed to access their locker and what time of day and how to do it. Here's a real quick tip. I get two kinds of, for kids who have a really hard time knowing when to swap out, I get two kinds of colors of painter's tape, maybe blue and yellow, or I think there's three colors, blue, yellow, and green. And I put a piece of tape on across the binder that will remove and not hurt the book. And the blue taped books might be for the morning, and the yellow taped books might be for the afternoon, and kids are to swap it out or switch them at lunchtime. That's just a quick tip for having kids have their books and materials with them but not lug it all around in their backpack. Finally, this is just another step towards independence, and it's an important one. And kids decorate their lockers, and they have certain things in them, but it's a private place. If it's shared, you're not messing around with your partner's things, and there needs to be some organization and routines around a locker. So finally, middle school is another time in a student's life for positive growth and greater independence. Students can further develop their unique interests as well as develop new and exciting interests. It's all about maturing and learning, but having fun too. So it's a scary thing. Middle school kids come to that building with a lot of misinterpretations. As I mentioned in the elementary school webinar, if there's any opportunity for kids to go up to the middle school in the springtime with their peers, maybe a small group, and see the building in operation, and then access it during the summertime, walk around with their parents, come and meet their teachers before school starts. Any of those kinds of things are very, very helpful so that our children can have less anxiety and be more ready for middle school, because it is a great opportunity for all. Thank you very much, and if you'll take a minute at the conclusion of my speaking, you'll see that there are 3 additional pages that have resources and templates that are for your use. I've written some workbooks that can be used in the spring or over the summer that can further explain middle school, that you can customize with your own pictures. And there's a complete transition notebook for your use that was written at Columbia Regional Programs. It's not intended that you'll use it all, but maybe part. And I just thank you for taking this opportunity to watch this. I hope it helps.
For more information, please visit our website.